So looking at natural law again, I'm not going to take time to explain all of these because there's just so much here. But many of our most precious rights are in the idea of inalienable rights, of habeas corpus, that you cannot be held indefinitely without being charged, the ideas of limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances that we're going to talk about next week, the right to make contracts, the institution of marriage, your right to reparations, the right to bear arms, the right to have representation, and that taxation is not to be used as a weapon to control your behavior. All of these things flow from this concept of natural law. But we come now in our study to something that I think for every one of us is both a challenge and is in many ways tremendously frightening. And as you read the writings of the founders, they make it very, very clear that a free people cannot survive long under a Republican Constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong. Now, the word Republican there is not to be associated with the Republican Party. If we had to look to the Republican Party for virtuous and morally strong, we would probably be in a world of hurt. But at the same time, the word Republican there refers to our form of government and to the republic for which it stands. We pledge allegiance. A republic is a form of government in which individuals place the authority that's given to them, like we use the example of the police officer, place their authority to govern themselves in selected individuals who operate in their stead until such time as the individual who has given them that personal authority recalls them in our system through the ballot box. But our founders were very, very clear that if we are not virtuous and morally strong, the chance of our republic continuing and our freedoms to be protected becomes increasingly unlikely. Samuel Adams, who is called the father of the American Revolution, did a tremendous amount of writing at the time, at the start, and I prefer, this is just a personal thing, to call it the War for Independence. It wasn't truly a revolution in a political sense of the word. So at the beginning of the War of Independence, he did a tremendous amount of writing. Newspapers, broadsides, pamphlets. And if you were to read and study them, the basic theme that Samuel Adams, the question that he asks over and over and over is this: are the American people virtuous enough to handle liberty? Ben Franklin said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. George Washington said, the American Constitution will survive only so long as there shall remain any virtue in the body of the people. John Adams, our Constitution was made only for moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. This is, to me, kind of like a fire bell in the night. Because I think even as Christians, sometimes our tendency is to think that political problems can be met with simply political answers. When essentially what our founders have told us is we've given you a system that depends upon the ability of each man and woman to govern themselves. James Madison Jefferson, the father of the Constitution, once said, "We have staked the entire future of this civilization on the ability of every man to govern himself under the 10 Commandments of God." Now, again, I believe we should be politically active. I stand on street corners holding signs. I've gone to Washington 4 times in the last year. I get probably 50 emails a day from every Tea Party in the country. So I believe in being politically active. But again, what I want to say to us as a church is, this is bigger than red state, blue state, Democrat, and Republican. This is about who the American people are. It is about who we are. And we can vote in good people to a point, but that by itself is not enough. In many ways, what I think our founders are saying to us is, the way you live your life is critical to the success of this experiment we call the United States of America. Samuel Adams said this, "The sum of all is, if we would most truly enjoy the gift of heaven, let us become a virtuous people. Then shall we both deserve and enjoy it. While on the other hand, if we are universally vicious and debauched in our manners," that means our lifestyle, "though the form of our Constitution carry the face of the most exalted freedom, we shall in reality be the abject slaves." To me, what Mr. Adams is saying to us is this: knowing the Constitution, demanding a return to the Constitution is important and it's critical. But the document itself does not have the power to guarantee our liberties. We have a role that has to be played. After the end of the Constitution Convention, Benjamin Franklin, as I told you, was carried out on kind of like a divan kind of thing. 6 convicts carried him back and forth. He was a little over 80 at that point. And a woman met him outside and said, "Sir, what kind of government have you given us?" And Mr. Franklin's response was, "Madam, you have a republic if you can keep it." So it is critical, and I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, but I think this is so important for us to understand the role of morality to the success of our country. This is an opinion, and I will label it as such. Like you know, we hang around with a lot of Tea Parties, we stand on a lot of street corners, we listen to a lot of Fox News. I am personally concerned about a trend that I see within the conservative movement in America, and that is to be a fiscal conservative and a social liberal. This is my opinion. Don't shout me down when I start preaching real good. There is no such thing in the American system. Ultimately, you either obey God's laws or you don't.
Yes.
And if we don't obey God's laws, we lose what we have been given. So I'm very concerned by this trend that I see to support. To me, it's almost a selfishness. I don't want anybody to tell me what to do, but I don't want you stealing my money either. It is almost an extreme form of selfishness. Nobody can take mine and nobody can tell me what to do. Now, that's my opinion. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. I was honest to label it my opinion. But it is a concern that I see in even the constitutional movement in this country. The writings of our founders are very clear in defining for us what this idea of virtue is. Generally, what they considered virtue was obedience to the 10 Commandments and to the Golden Rule. The American system produced something that is unlike anything else in the rest of the world, and that is what is called the self-governing Christian. Like Mr. Madison said, the ability of each one of us to govern ourselves and our behavior in relationship to what God tells us are His standards of treatment toward Him and treatment toward other people. George Washington alerts us to another problem which I see fairly rampant in our country today. In his farewell address, he says, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life? If the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice." What he's referring to is when you go into court and you're allowed, you raise your, you put your hand on the Bible and you say, "So help me God." Their understanding was that was not just a cultural practice. That was you affirming the fact that I'm going to stand sometime before a holy God and give an account for the testimony that I'm about to provide. And then he goes on to say, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles." Now again, I'm going to label this my opinion. And to a point, I think it's better than nothing. But when I drive by a public school, for example, and I know in many ways the anti-religion, anti-God attitude that is often there. But you see, the character quality of the week is honesty, or the character quality is this or the other. There is a part of me that remembers what Mr. Washington had said, to a point, that's better than nothing. But ultimately, I think the honest seeker, using that reasoning power, would say, wait a minute. If there is no God, and if there is no final reckoning when I have to give an account for myself, if all this just happened by accident, why would I be nice to people? Why shouldn't I get mine now? Why should I care about what happens to you? That's the logical conclusion that I think an honest person almost has to come from. And that's what our founders, why they felt that it was so critical that you had an understanding, and we're going to get that to them in a minute, about what the basics, the basic tenets of the Judeo-Christian ethic are. Because if there's not ultimately a God that made the rules, and to whom you have to give an account, why have the rules? Moving on. One of the things that our founders were very, very committed to is the concept that a virtuous and moral people must be led by virtuous leaders. Do you remember that important line from the Declaration last week, where it talked about how the king had recused himself of being the leader of a free people? His behavior had disqualified him from leading free